So hello and welcome to another episode of Geographics. I'm your interim host, Carl Smallwood. Yes, that is my real name. And today we're talking about Herculaneum, the city frozen in time. And this is a video based on an original article by Larry Holsworth. So check out their socials below and let's get to it. On an autumn day in 79 AD, the people of the coastal Mediterranean city of Herculaneum went about their business unperturbed. The Campanian town was a wealthy one, and its population enjoyed the status and protection as citizens of Rome. The roughly 4,000 inhabitants of the city wore the heavier clothing of autumn, and the heat of the Mediterranean summer having been replaced by the cooler autumn temperatures. In the shops, the fresh fruits of autumn, including pomegranates, awaited selection in baskets, jars of wine, recently made from that year's grape harvest, stood alongside them. That afternoon, a Roman magistrate and lawyer known as Pliny the Younger was resting at Resina, an important naval port in the Roman Empire. His uncle, the aptly named Pliny the Elder, commanded the fleet there. The port was located about 29 kilometers from the most dominant geographic feature of the region, Mount Vesuvius, visible to the south across the bay. Herculaneum sat between Misenum and Vesuvius, less than 6 kilometers from the mountain and its olive tree-covered slopes. At about 1 p.m, according to the letters Pliny the Younger wrote 25 years after the event, these are the only known historical first-hand eyewitness accounts of the event for anyone curious, Vesuvius erupted violently. Ash and other volcanic material were launched more than 30 kilometers into the sky. Pliny described it as appearing as an inverted pine tree. Prevailing winds to the southeast in the direction of the larger Roman city of Pompeii, which suffered little other than terror and panic at first. People fled as ash began to fall, the great cloud of material darkened the sky, though flames and hotspots could be seen on Vesuvius throughout the day and indeed the following night. In Misenum, Pliny the Elder organised a rescue operation using ships to reach the stricken coastal towns to evacuate the panicked citizens. He invited his nephew to join him. The younger man demurred. Pliny the Elder did not survive the rescue mission. On the second day of the eruption, the massive column of volcanic material collapsed onto the sides of the volcano and the surrounding areas. Herculaneum was buried almost instantly, the remaining residents incinerated by superheated rock. More than 10 kilometers from Vesuvius, the temperatures exceeded some 350 degrees Celsius. A mixture of ash, hot gases, and molten rock flowed down the mountainside in a series of 6 devastating surges. It's unlikely anyone in Herculaneum survived the first. The city was buried to a depth of over 30 meters. For centuries, it was believed that, unlike Pompeii, which was buried in ash the very first day, there were relatively few killed in the city of Herculaneum. It was believed that the nearly 24 hours between the eruption and the arrival of the aforementioned surges allowed sufficient time for people to flee. Some surely did, but a record of escaping the disaster in that city has never really been found. In recent years, excavations along the waterfront have revealed hundreds of skeletal remains preserved over the centuries by the heat which killed them. About 75% of the town of Herculaneum remains undisturbed, meaning there are likely many more skeletons hiding beneath the ground. From the areas which have been excavated and studied, like in its larger, better-known neighbour Pompeii, much has been learned about the lives of people in the 1st century AD, as well as what happened on that fateful day in autumn 79 AD. Here is some of that story. In 79 AD, the city of Herculaneum was already several centuries old. Legend ascribed its founding to the Greek god Heracles, later known as Hercules to the Romans, in around 1200 BC, hence its name. Others claim the city was founded about 500 years later than that by an ancient people known as the Oscans. Eventually, the city fell under the control of the Etruscans and later the Greeks. Its favourable location on the Bay of Naples made it a valuable trading and fishing port. By the 1st century BC, it was under Roman control. Sometime before the 2nd century, the Samnites, an Italian people of the region of Campania, took control of the city and fortified it by constructing walls around its urban centre. Along its waterfront, the walls were faced with volcanic stone embedded in the concrete. The city's value as a trading centre decreased with the development of other nearby towns which featured larger harbours, such as Misenum. Herculaneum instead then became the equivalent of a modern-day seaside resort. As such, it featured large and, some will say, lavish private homes, both within its walls and the outlying areas in the countryside. At least 2 large public baths stood within the city, along with multiple municipal buildings, a theatre, parks, even recreational areas, fountains, and even seaside promenades. Temporary residents, including the Casa del Albergo, the house at the inn, welcomed its many visitors. In 62 AD, an earthquake struck the region of Campania, resulting in extensive damage to both Herculaneum and the neighbouring Pompeii. The Roman historian and philosopher Seneca the Younger recorded the event for posterity. He reported poisonous gases released from the chasms by the quake as causing the death of more than 600 sheep in the surrounding countryside, so unlucky to be a sheep in that time, but not a person. Both Herculaneum and Pompeii suffered some structural damage, much of which was still under repair when a far more catastrophic and famous event occurred just some 17 years later. By 79 AD, the population of the city stood at an estimated 35 to 4,000 individuals. The city held the status of a municipium, meaning residents were citizens of Rome. Most of the commerce in the city was of a self-sustaining nature. Trade was largely among its own citizens for the purpose of basic existence. Local products allowed the city to remain largely self-sufficient, which only really consumed produce from the outlying countryside and from the fishermen which operated from its own small port. Though an old city, much of Herculaneum as well as Pompeii was relatively new construction, having been rebuilt following damage sustained from earthquakes or as a result of normal expansion of the area. The populace enjoyed agricultural abundance and a favourable climate. According to Pliny the Younger, tremors of the earth were relatively common but largely regarded as benign. For centuries, it was believed the catastrophic eruption of Vesuvius, which destroyed Pompeii, took place at the height of summer, with August the most widely accepted time period. This error is sometimes attributed to a misunderstanding of the dating scheme used by manuscript writers when copying, by hand it should be noted, the letters of Pliny the Younger. As a result, many sources still available today lead the reader to believe that the eruption began in August 79 AD, as Pliny the Younger reported in a letter to Tacitus. Tacitus requested that Pliny supply the historian with a description of the death of his uncle, the aforementioned Pliny the Elder, during the eruption of Vesuvius. The Younger's letter, translated from Latin, says, in part, and I quote, "He was at Misenum in his capacity as commander of the fleet on the 9th day before the calendar of September, when the first evidence of volcanic events appeared." Pliny goes on to describe his uncle's actions, including sailing to the stricken areas and his subsequent death on shore. Although it's worth noting that Pliny the Younger did not really see any of the events reported in his letter, it is considered to be the only first-hand account of the events of that day, and as such came the belief of an August eruption. In a second letter, though, describing his own actions and experiences during the eruption, Pliny the Younger described his flight in the company of his mother. He wrote of the general panic among the people fleeing because, volcano erupting, as well as the ash which covered the landscape like snow. The worst of the damage was distant from Misenum in his account, on the slopes of Vesuvius and nearby its flanks, though reported shaking off falling ash again and again in his letters. He did not leave an account of people being buried beneath. Most of the falling ash was far away to the west, carried away by the prevailing winds. Southeasterly winds are a meteorological feature of the region, but only in autumn. In contrast, during the summer, the winds are not steady and predominantly from the west. The winds at the time of the eruption were steady in a southeasterly direction. The winds protected Herculaneum from the fall of ash on the very first day, after all. Pompeii, southeast of Vesuvius, however, was buried under falling ash the very same day, with roughly 40% of the fatalities in that city caused by asphyxiation. In contrast, most of the deaths in Herculaneum were the result of heat. Vesuvius spewed forth 6 individual surges, as mentioned, of pyroclastic materials, with temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius, which overflowed the city in waves. So it's widely believed that the ash which buried Pompeii is what helped preserve the many skeletons and remains that survived from that period. It did not, at least not in all cases. So to explain why the ash did preserve the bodies, it's not in the way you expect. The falling ash basically just created chasms or voids where the remains were, and then when they were discovered by archaeologists many years later, they poured plaster into these, like pseudo-molds, and those are what remains. So many of the remains from Pompeii are just plaster casts of the hollows left by the actual remains, thankfully provided by the ash. Doesn't stop it being any less creepy though, does it? In Herculaneum, however, the intense heat instantly carbonized the skeletons as well as other materials it encountered, including wood, papyrus, and other organic matter. And it's study of those materials which has led to a better understanding of the events of 79 AD, including roughly when it occurred. And for anyone curious about the evidence supporting the now generally accepted October eruption of Vesuvius, this includes the clothing worn by the citizens of Herculaneum, the food available in the shops, and the prevailing meteorological conditions of fall. Clothing was heavier than would be worn in the heat of summer. Autumn fruits were available in the market. Summer fruits were absent, other than as preserved, indicating that they'd either been eaten or weren't present. And as noted, that year's grape harvest had already been made into wine. All of these point to mid-autumn. There have also been coins discovered in Pompeii which were minted in Rome during the summer of 79 AD, and it's highly unlikely these would have reached the city by August. In 2022, a convention studied the evidence and, despite Pliny the Younger's contention in his letter to Tacitus, established the date of the demise of Pompeii and Herculaneum at about October 24th, 25th. They really can be that accurate with the right evidence. For many years, it was believed that most of the population of Herculaneum escaped the disaster on the first day by simply fleeing over land or by water. More recent scholarship, though, disputes this assumption. For one thing, there is a lack of eyewitness reports of the eruption. The population of the city was some 4,000 people at the time, and they were all quite wealthy and well-educated. Surely one of them would have written about surviving such a catastrophic and well-known event in history. Likewise, numerous historians cite the eruption, including Tacitus and the Jewish historian Josephus, without citing accounts of any real survivors, other than the aforementioned Pliny the Younger. The waterfront of Herculaneum contains several arch-shaped vaults with wooden support beams within. These vaults stood along the ancient beachfront before the walls of a city. In the early 1980s, excavations along the beach and the vaults began to turn up skeletal remains on the beach. Eventually, 12 of the stone vaults were excavated, and by the 1990s, skeletal remains of over 340 people were unearthed within and near the vaults. These vaults are now believed to have been the boathouses. The support beams within were used to raise boats out of the water for storage and general maintenance. Remains found within the boathouse were often densely packed, crowded together, and with more people than they could comfortably accommodate. The majority of skeletal remains found in the boathouse were those of women and of children, while those on the exposed beach were of men. This led to the assumption that some of the panicked population fled to the boathouses, vainly seeking rescue from the sea. It is known, as noted previously, that Pliny the Elder did attempt to rescue by sea, and a messenger was dispatched from Resina to inform the people of his arrival. As the women and children packed into the vaulted boathouses, the men awaited rescue by boat on the beach. The advancing surge of hot gas, ash and molten rock, moving at over 160 kilometers per hour, advanced inexorably towards the waterfront until the heat killed those huddled there in their last hope for shelter. The general posture and layout of many of these remains supports this hypothesis. The vaults shielded the panicked occupants from direct contact, but they could not protect them from the heat. Just look at my face. I'm inside in a nice, sheltered area, with a window open and a fan over there. And I can't deal with the heat. I dread to think what 160 kilometers of molten rock flying towards me like 50 monster trucks would do. For example, most of the victims sport contracted hands and feet, which indicate fulminance or explosive shock among most of the victims discovered. Such shock is indicative of sudden death from excessive deadly heat. Two examples of skeletal remains discovered along the waterfront were of particular interest. Discovered in 1982, one is known simply as the Ringed Lady, a skeleton named for the large number of rings worn on her fingers, indicative of wealth. Another was discovered near the remains of a boat on the beach. He wore a dagger, indicating he was a military officer of some sort, and was possibly a member of the rescue mission who succumbed to the heat when the surge reached the beach. Now, as noted, the number of casualties found on the beach and in the boathouses exceeds 340, which would be about 8% of the assumed population of Herculaneum. As over 75% of the city remains unexcavated, the number of all the casualties to be found in the city where people may have sought asylum is, to put it simply, unknown. It could be much higher. Further excavations of the beach area are hampered by the fact in the 21st century Herculaneum it is about 4 metres below sea level. It is also hampered by modern politics and conflicting views of excavation of the ruins. Excavations began at Herculaneum in the early 18th century. They were the result of local farmers and residents simply digging for wells around the site and discovering it. Apparently these occasionally yielded ancient artifacts, which were sometimes sold, sometimes accidentally destroyed, and sometimes, stolen. Because, of course, people are gonna people. These sometimes led to more organised attempts by treasure hunters to pillage the area. Unlike Pompeii, which had been buried by ash, which made digging much easier, Herculaneum's site was buried beneath what had been molten rock to a depth which exceeded some 30 metres in certain areas. Digging was limited to the excavation of tunnels around sites where items of interest had been found. In 1738, after several years of exploration by treasure hunters, the Bourbon King of Naples, Charles VII, sponsored an archaeological expedition. Charles's hope was to unearth artifacts for display at his Museum Herculaneum, a section of his royal palace in the Campanian town of Portici. 12 years later, farmers digging a well report the discovery of buried walls indicating a large structure. Within this structure, numerous scrolls were discovered. The scrolls had been near instantly carbonized, rendering them impossible to be unrolled or read. For the next couple of years, numerous scrolls were unearthed and simply discarded, believed to be of little historical value, especially in comparison to statuary and precious metals. In 1752, Bernardo Tanucci, a statesman, scholar, and advisor to King Charles, recommended the establishment of a commission to study the scrolls, which were recorded on papyrus. Excavation of the site was placed under the supervision of Joaquin de Albiere, a awesomely named Spanish military official and engineer whose name I hope I pronounced correctly. And he also excavated the site of Pompeii, so he had, some, but I'm going to say pretty good experience dealing with almost that exact same thing. To assist him, Charles commissioned Carl Weber, a Swiss engineer. Neither Weber or Alcubert, nor the curators of the Museum of Herculaneum, had any real experience in the handling or interpretation of the scrolls, which eventually numbered some 1,800. An unknown additional number of scrolls were destroyed during the excavation of the rooms in which they were found. Some were damaged as they were extracted from the rock, others were unrecognisable and simply discarded. Nonetheless, the number of scrolls remains the largest collection of samples from a library of antiquity ever found, and led to the partial excavation of the building in which they were found. It is now known today as the Villa of the Papyri. Who built the villa remains an uncertainty. Some have speculated that it was the home of, and this is a long word so you have to bear with me here folks, Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesarius, father-in-law of Julius Caesar. Others have speculated that the building was the home of Philodemus, a poet and Epicurean philosopher. The Epicureans believed that there was no afterlife and that life's true reward came from living well and enjoying luxury, fine art, and a hedonistic lifestyle. The owner of the site, known as the Villa Papyri, exhibited such beliefs. Although it remains only partially excavated in the 21st century, it's believed that the villa was one of the largest and most luxuriously furnished in all of antiquity. It features swimming pools and fountains, it overlooked the Bay of Naples from 5 terrace floors, its views of the sea was wholly unobstructed, numerous bronze busts decorated its many levels, including one believed to belong to Scipio Africanus, the Roman military commander who defeated Hannibal in the Second Punic War. More recent research disputes the bust's authenticity as representative of Scipio. Numerous frescoes and paintings were preserved within the building and remain there to this day, while most of the statues have been removed for display in other museums dedicated to ancient Rome and Herculaneum in specifics. Over 2,800 square metres of the site remain unexcavated as of 2022, when the article this video was based on was written and researched, in part because the modern community of Ercolano rose above the buried ruins of the city, and digging in the ancient site would have a detrimental effect on the modern town. Modern science has allowed the papyri to be studied more closely by scholars, and over 1,000 of the scrolls have been identified as the writings of Philodemus, who was an unknown prior to discovery and interpretation of these scrolls. There is also evidence that most of the scrolls have been packed in shipping crates as if they were being prepared to be shipped to safety before the surging pyroclastic flow overwhelmed the town. In the process, it preserved them for centuries. Numerous factions and political issues impact the continued excavation of the villa, and much of it remaining hidden, with presumably more evidence of opulence and wealth waiting to be unearthed. In a similar manner, a large number of the scrolls remain unopened and unread, too delicate to risk damaging them in an attempt to reveal their contents. Most of the statues, including some which were identified as ancient copies of even more ancient works of art, have similarly been relocated to other facilities for their protection. In the 1970s, the American oil billionaire J. Paul Getty commissioned an architectural firm to replicate the villa and his Malibu ranch. With much of the villa then unrevealed, the architect borrowed liberally from other Roman houses and villas in their design. It opened as a museum displaying Getty's personal collection of ancient artifacts and antiquities in the mid-1970s. Today, it serves as an annex to the Getty Center Museum. The residents of Herculaneum enjoyed fresh water delivered direct to their home via lead pipes. They weren't that smart. The water was provided by the Serino Aqueduct, one of the largest and most complex water supply systems in the entire ancient world. Built during the Augustan period, the aqueduct also provided fresh water to Pompeii, Misenum, and other Campanian cities and towns. Many of the homes thus far excavated also featured an Impluvium, which was used to capture and route rainwater into pools or cisterns for later use. The 2 public bathhouses uncovered, one for women and one for men, also featured an Impluvium to ensure a steady supply of fresh water, in addition to that provided by the aqueduct. The bathhouses were intended for social interaction more than bathing, since most private homes contained baths of appropriate opulence to the dwelling in which they were found. Most of the private homes and public buildings were also connected to a sewer system which drained into the Bay of Naples, the place where all the boats and fish came from. I don't want to eat the poo fish. So some public baths and other buildings were simply emptied into street drains, however. The city's main sewage drain ran from the Forum, which as of 2022 remains unexcavated. Herculaneum's status as a haven for visitors is attested to by the presidents of inns, the equivalent of modern hotels, which featured waterfront rooms and access to recreational facilities. In addition, facilities for dining outside of the home, in restaurants and snack bars and the like, were discovered in Herculaneum and Pompeii, as well as evidence that men and women followed substantially different diets. For anyone curious, it appears that men consumed more sea-based protein, while women were wont to eat meats from the land-based domesticated animals, such as sheep and fowl. Both consumed olives and grapes in great abundance, both as food and as oils in the case of grapes, as wine. In private homes, which have been partially excavated, they're all pretty large, with spacious interiors, ornate atria, balconies and gardens and the like. Some examples of the Roman furnishings have been excavated, including a Triclinium, a dining couch on which 3 occupants could recline while leisurely enjoying their meal. Why do we have those now? I'd have one of those. I would have a 3-person reclining eating couch in my home. That'd be amazing for, playing Smash Bros and eating pizza. Dining in this manner was described by Pliny the Younger, who recorded his uncle enjoying a repast in such a manner on the day Vesuvius erupted. Oh man, so he was just enjoying some time on his triple reclining couch, and then just the world ended. That's a rough way to go. Pliny the Younger also recorded that it was common to bathe in the sun prior to bathing in cold water on a daily basis. Always sun your balls, a practice enjoyed at seaside resorts to the present day. After Herculaneum was buried by the eruption in 79 AD, the area was slowly repopulated, though the ancient resort was largely forgotten. Eventually, the medieval town of Resina arose on the site. Today it's known as Ercolano, a town which is part of metropolitan Naples. Both the ancient excavation and the modern town exist in the shadow of Vesuvius, still an active volcano for anyone curious, and its most recent eruption took place in 1944. Today, like the remains of the town it obliterated in 79 AD, it is a tourist trap, although tourism is not a major source of income for the residents of the area. Most visitors to the ruins prefer to stay in nearby Naples. The main industry in the region is nursery gardening, the growing of flowers for the commercial market. Seismic activity is still relatively commonplace into the 21st century. To return once again to the words of Pliny the Younger, such quakes are a common occurrence and no cause for panic. Pliny wrote those words after experiencing firsthand the panic which Vesuvius was capable of creating. Whether it will again induce panic is impossible for anyone to guess, but today over 3 million people live and work within the region. It's so thoroughly buried nearly 2,000 years ago. So thank you for everyone for tuning in to this episode of Geographics. As mentioned at the start of the video, I've been your interim host, Cal Smallwood. Yes, that is my real name. You can see so for yourself by following me on social media. As mentioned as well, this video is based on an original article by Larry Holsworth. You can find details to their socials as well if they provided them for us. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like. If you've got anything to say about it, especially my pronunciation, I'm really trying for that, and my enunciation as well. I know that's been a common source of complaint for people who are during this transitionary period. I really am trying to better enunciate my words. I am used to just, rattling off and just speaking within a stream of consciousness type manner as I am right now. And you can see examples of this on my own channel, Fact Fiend with Cal Smallwood, and the channel I help co-host, Wiki Weekends, which I host with my friend Lucas Holland, also linked below. Otherwise, if you enjoyed the videos, want to see more like this, subscribe if you haven't already, and as I always like to say, have the day you all deserve.